Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm Faye.
And I'm James. So Faye, what's your week been like so far?
Well, I had a really interesting introduction to a gentleman called Kartik Ganesh, who's from Tata Motors. And the introduction came from Pawan, who I know you will know, Pawan Shwetha from Lark Optics. And Kartik was looking for some advice on the Cambridge ecosystem and how to hook up with people in different aspects of innovation. And Pawan's like, you got to go and speak to Faye. So I had a really good conversation with him, really interesting stuff. Obviously, Kartik's interested in motors, he's Tata Motors, but all different types and aspects of innovation and how it can change car journeys and automotive vehicles and all of those kinds of things. That was super interesting. I kind of think I get asked to do so many of those things. I think I need to work out a way of being billable for it, but no, I'm only joking. I also caught up with Eamon Bradley from Cladara. We've spoken about those about Cladara in the past. They're the ones who sponsor Cambridge United Football Club Stadium, and they're looking at building relationships here in Cambridge. So that was kind of a very similar conversation. Caught up with Tabitha Goldstaub as well, brainstorming some interesting tech people from outside of Cambridge. That was a really useful conversation, and really focusing on deep tech and, focusing on what the USP is, if you like, for Cambridge. And then I've decided to do this new thing where every Friday I'm just going to go out and meet people. I think I'm trying to be more productive by optimizing my own time. We'll talk about optimization in a bit, I think. So one of the visits I did went and saw Paul Hodson over at Barclays Eagle Labs.
Yeah, we were up there the other week as well. The refurb's really nice, isn't it? Yeah,
and you've been going to other places that have been refurbed this week, right?
Yeah, everyone's refurbing, it seems. Yeah, I haven't met as many people as you this week by the sounds of it, but yesterday I was out and about on the west side of Cambridge. So I was over at the Postdoc Academy, I went to the West Hub, and also went to Idea Space, as you say, who've also just gone through a big refresh. So it was really nice to see that. It's made such a difference. It's really, really different as you walk in, really open and really fresh. So a big thank you to Ben Hartley for his hospitality on the visit.
Yeah, you see, now I feel jealous because I actually know you've said that I went to the West Hub as well. I went to see Christine Martin of the Seeds Fund and Cambridge Enterprise. So yeah, I did hop over that way as well.
I very briefly saw Dermot as well. We said hello at the in the cafe area in the West Hub.
Has he started his new role yet?
2 weeks, I think he said.
2 weeks, crikey. Good. Yes, so another busy week, and another busy week in the news as well. There's lots of news going on, so we've just picked out some of the highlights here. So first up, Poly AI and Riverlane have both been included in TechNation's Future 50 programme. The 2024 cohort was unveiled at a Downing Street reception this week, and being part of Future 50 offers these company executives unparalleled access and exposure to peer-to-peer networks, business leaders and other investors, and the opportunity to connect and share with world-class mentors. So really great news for those two companies. Riverlane, obviously Cambridge. Poly AI was born in Cambridge, but now London-based.
Yeah, it's nice to see the TechNation Future 50 brand back again, isn't it, after the change? And like you said last week, do we have to take a shot every time we mention Riverlane on the podcast now? It seems to be every week. Okay, so the next story. Super Dielectrics has formally launched their Faraday 1 product, which is a state-of-the-art hybrid energy storage technology. The energy storage market is currently dominated by lithium-ion and lead-acid batteries. So Super Dielectrics' new polymer-based energy storage technology solves the issue of dealing with rapidly fluctuating and intermittent renewable energy, which makes it difficult to currently store solar and wind energy economically.
So I know you're going to come on to some other events in Cambridge, but we also have an event over in Norwich on April the 23rd, where leading entrepreneurs and businesses are going to be participating in a pre-event with the University of East Anglia to raise awareness of the upcoming Cambridge Tech Week in September. Speakers will include serial entrepreneur Martin Frost, who was at the helm of robotics pioneer CMR Surgical and who made key contacts globally and raised so much cash for the company that it soared to unicorn status really quickly.
The finalists for this year's Cambridge Independent Science and Tech Awards have been announced. They'll be held in May over at Hingston Hall, I believe. And we'll actually be talking to Paul Brackley, who's the editor of Cambridge Independent, in an upcoming episode. And it was really great to see so many of the finalists have been featured in previous podcast episodes. So we must be doing something right. Are you ready for this list? It's pretty long. This includes Riverlane, Drink. We spoke to Rebecca Simmons. You may remember Sanogenetics, Anne Patrick Short, Orcascan, John Doherty, Bug Biome, Alicia Showering, Second Mind, Gary Brookman, and Pragmatic Scott White, which I think was actually our first ever episode, wasn't it? Valula, Abil Mar, and Enhanced 3D Genomics. So congratulations to all of them.
Yeah, and definitely. And there's lots of others also on that list that have been featured in the news slots. So we haven't yet got them on the podcast, but we regularly update them in this particular slot. So companies like Forefront RF, New Quantum, CMR Surgical, we've just talked about, Paragraph, IQ Geo, the list just goes on.
Yeah, and as you said, a little shout out for some upcoming tech events around Cambridge. We did this for the first time last week, and hopefully people will find it useful. If you're an organizer and you have a tech event coming up, just pop over the details and we'll give you a shout out. There's a quick reminder that we mentioned last week. There's a Trailblazing Women in STEM event at the Bradfield Centre on the 28th of March. The Cambridge IET Engineering and Technology Meetup has an event on the 18th of April, which is called Engineering High-Speed Gusts for Safer Aircrafts and Greener Skies. And that's being held at MathWorks. You can get tickets for that on meetup.com. The Marketing Meetup returns to the Bradfield Centre on the 4th of April. And then on the 16th of April, are you ready for this? You can build an API to control the Mars rover. That's the Cambridge Software Crafters Meetup. So we'll link to all of those in our show notes, which you can find on the podcast website.
Perfect. And that just reminds me as well, it's the Would I Cite You event with Cambridge Science Centre next week as well. And I know we've talked about that on a previous episode. And I'll be there ready to record it for the podcast as well. Okay, so let's move on to today's episode. I'm thrilled today that we are going to talk to Kerry McInerney, who has co-edited a book called The Good Robot, Why Technology Needs Feminism. Hi, Kerry. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with a little bit of background for you, please. Would you like to just introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. So I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. I'm a research fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. As of April 1st, I will be a senior research fellow, which is very exciting. And over at the Leverhulme Centre, I co-chair a research stream called The Global Politics of AI, which looks at the impact of AI on international relations. But a lot of my work for the past few years has focused on how AI might amplify different kinds of discrimination, particularly related to gender and race, and has thought about what feminism in particular can bring to our conversations about AI and ethics, and so how feminism can help us imagine different kinds of futures with technology.
So you just mentioned the Leverhulme Centre then. What's the purpose of that? Is that specifically the research that you're looking into?
Yes, so the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence is an AI ethics-focused research centre, and it's part of the wider Institute for Technology and Humanity at Cambridge, which is headed up by Dr. Stephen Cave. The purpose of the centre is it brings together people from a wide range of disciplines and backgrounds who are all deeply concerned about and doing a lot of research into the impact of AI and other new data-driven technologies on our societies. And so we have people working on this from a very technical standpoint, from an engineering engineering and computer science standpoint. And we also have people like myself there who might come from backgrounds like political science, sociology, philosophy, who are trying to think more broadly about what these technologies do in our societies and our politics. So the Centre was founded in 2016. I've been there since 2020 or affiliated in some way since then. And I find it a really vibrant and interesting research community. And we love to hear from people as well. So if you're interested in the research we're doing, please feel free to reach out.
You're also in the AI Now Institute as well. Do you want to just introduce that organisation too?
Yes, sure. So I'm a research fellow at the AI Now Institute, which is a leading policy think tank in New York. I worked with them on their 2023 AI landscape report, which was looking at the monopolization of tech resources by a few big tech companies, and argued that we needed to confront this monopoly and break down this hold that big tech has over American politics and life. And right now I do a lot of work with them on the rhetoric of an AI arms race between the US and China. So again, thinking about the impact of AI and the narratives around AI on international relations. And it's been a real privilege to work at that policy institute. I really admire Sarah and Amber, who lead the institute, and have learned a lot from them and the approach they take to trying to make better tech policy.
No, that's great. And one thing you just talked about international and the reach of your work. I noticed a slight accent of yours.
Yes, I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I came to the UK when I was 18 for my undergraduate degree here at Cambridge, and I'm still here. And I met my husband at Cambridge, and so I'm currently living in London. But I have to admit, the allure of New Zealand definitely calls to me. I'd love to go back one day, but right now I'm very happy where I am.
So you touched there on the kind of research that you were doing in the introduction. Can we maybe go a little bit deeper into that and kind of unpick exactly what's in that research?
Yes, sure. I have to admit, this is a bit hard for me because I feel like I have my fingers in a lot of different pies. So I'll do the best that I can. So I'd say broadly, my research sits in kind of three pots. So that first pot is the one I mentioned around AI and international relations. So in the global politics of AI stream, we're looking at questions all the way from thinking about international AI governance. So how do we control and regulate AI, and how do we make sure that those regulations are responsive to local contexts and the particular needs people have in these different spaces? It also includes a lot of work on data colonialism and how AI might be entrenching these kinds of global inequalities born out of previous histories of colonialism and extraction. And so one of my fears is that AI and big data becomes sort of the newest form of extraction of the global south by the global north. And then finally, increasingly, we want to do a lot more work thinking about how AI is being integrated into migration and border control. And there are a lot of fantastic scholars who do research on this. And my PhD research was on immigration detention, so this is something that deeply concerns me. So that's kind of one part, which is thinking very broadly about how these technologies, the narratives around them, and the regulation around them travels across time and space and across borders. So actually just last Friday, I was hosting a conference which was on AI analogies. So thinking about the kinds of analogies we draw between AI and other technologies and developments in international politics. So one of the analogies that I think is very common is nuclear. Another is the space race. And so this conference was asking, are these analogies helpful? What do they give us? What do they not give us? So that's one big part. The second big part is specifically thinking about AI and racism and race. So some of that is looking at how new technologies might entrench racism in our societies. But I'm also quite interested in how science fiction written by Asian American authors or philosophy by Indigenous thinkers, among other kinds of philosophical approaches and ideas, can help us reimagine what tech should be and what it should look like. And then, the final part is the feminist work that I do on the Good Robot podcast and in some of my own writing, which is to say that even though feminism is sometimes imagined as being quite anti-technological or maybe not having that much to do with technology, we think that it has incredible things to say and that there's a really rich history of feminist thinkers engaging with how technology is shaping our lives and specifically why we need to build and make technologies that are themselves actively feminist rather than simply being reactive to the kinds of new inequalities that technologies might create. So that's a kind of a very broad summary of the kinds of questions I'm interested in.
And having gone through the book, you can definitely see how those topics that you're working on are going into the book. So we're going to talk about that in a moment because that's why you're here on the podcast. But I feel that first of all, we should reference Eleanor your co-editor, co-author, co-conspirator. I don't know. How would you like to introduce Dr. Eleanor Drage to us all?
Yes, my work wife and partner in crime, who is currently on a very well-earned holiday in Morocco while I'm sort of trapped in a soundproof pod in Cambridge. So I hope she's having a really wonderful time. Yes, so I've worked very, very closely with Eleanor over the past 3 or so years on topics relating to gender and technology. So that includes co-founding the Good Robot podcast together, co-hosting that, and then collaborating on a number of academic projects, from a book called Feminist AI, which we co-edited with Dr. Stephen Cave and Professor Jude Brown, which is this sort of leading collection on feminist approaches to artificial intelligence and data, through to the Good Robot book we're discussing today. And Eleanor and I are also in the process of writing a third book together, thinking about how feminism can help us challenge and reform the tech industry. So yeah, I feel very lucky to be working with her. A few, I guess, fun facts about her. She loves films that I consider very dull and frightening, like kind of black and white French films from the 50s. She has wonderfully bright colored hair and very delightful and wacky fashion sense. So you'll definitely know if you see her around Cambridge. Yes, and she's a very generous and compassionate friend as well. So a really wonderful person to get to work with.
Nice. And always nice to talk to a fellow Cambridge podcaster. How long has the podcast been going, and what can people expect, and where can they find it?
Yes, I think we've actually just hit 3 years, which is wild. We started during COVID because we had a budget on our project to do events, and we just thought no one can do another Zoom event. Like, we're so zoomed out right now. And then my husband, who was in radio, said, well, why not try a podcast? People are really passionate about audio formats. And so, yes, we've been going for about 3 years. There were a lot of mishaps along the way. I don't know if you also experienced this, where we were kind of finding our feet, trying to figure out what worked for us. But over time, it's been really beautiful to watch the podcast grow into something that not only brings people together, but also has a life of its own beyond what we expected of it. So getting emails from particularly teachers, for example, who now use the podcast to teach in their high school classrooms or their university classrooms. That's one of the kinds of outcomes I never expected from the podcast. And that's really precious to us.
Yeah, really nice to hear. And I believe that's a perfect segue to start talking about the book, because I believe the book is rooted in the podcast. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, the book is rooted in the podcast in 2 ways, I would say. So the first is it's a very direct kind of legacy of the podcast, or everyone who's in the book appeared, broadly speaking, in, say, the first season of our podcast. We've had so many amazing people on the podcast since then that I'm sad we haven't been able to have them all in. But these are a lot of our early guests and supporters. And when we were putting the book together, we actually sent them each the edited transcript of their episode and asked them to use that as inspiration for writing the essays that would then become the chapters of the book. So a very direct legacy in one sense. On the other hand, I also like to think of this book as being very much from the podcast in terms of its ethic and its goal, which is to make knowledge about AI ethics more accessible to a wide audience, but also to kind of imbue and center a feminist ethic in that, and to say, hey, feminism is not something that should be peripheral to tech ethics. It's not something that should be tacked on at the end, but it should be really at the heart of how we do good technology.
So let's jump straight in then, Kerry. And, I'm going to go straight to the intro where it states that good technology is feminist. And so I'm just going to quote a bit here that feminism is transformative. And when it comes to technology, we need better relations, better systems, better designs, better visions, and perhaps when these fail, better rebellions. It's a really nice framing of the conversation. And you've just said some of the podcasts, then, that's what dictated some of those themes. So just tell me a little bit more about how you shaped that as the format for the book.
These themes actually came out organically, so it's really nice to hear that it's a helpful framing because you never know if people will see things in the way that you see them. So we actually started in the opposite direction. We received in all these essays and we allowed people a lot of freedom with what they wrote their essay on. The only thing we asked them to do was to keep the essay under 2,000 words, to make it as accessibly written as possible, and to respond to the provocation, good technology is ... And we asked them to title their essay in that format. And so when you open the book, you'll see every chapter is good technology something, whether that's good technology is free or good technology challenges power. And then once we had all these essays in, we took all the titles, printed them out, chopped them up, because I love a bit of arts and crafts and mind mapping, and Eleanor endures it for my sake. So we laid it all out on the table and then started to see, how can we cluster or group these essays in a way that makes sense to us? And it was, of course, a bit of a messy process, but we realized that we were starting to find these interesting synergies and links between people who maybe had quite similar political views, but were going about this question of what good technology is and can be in quite different ways. So that's why we have some sections like good relations, which are more philosophical, more thinking about how AI and technology might impact our relationships with one another, through to people who are more policy focused and oriented, all the way through to people who want quite radical breaks with the existing system, which is our good rebellion section.
And give people a flavour that might not have listened to the podcast, the types of people that you've had on and who have written essays for the book.
Gosh, it's a real range. So we have a lot of people in this book who actually might not necessarily originally be seen as feminist thinkers. We have, of course, some classic feminist philosophers, people like Rosie Braidotti and Catherine Hales, who have been leading figures in paving the path for feminist science and technology studies. But we also have people like Suraj Hongaladoram, who's a Buddhist thinker. We have people like Jason Edward Lewis, who is one of the leading figures of the Indigenous AI Protocol and Working Group. And it was really important to us that we also were probing and challenging what we think the focus of feminism is and what it can be. And so while a lot of these thinkers might not necessarily always be using the words feminism or gender, they have at their heart this pro-justice approach that engages with a lot of different kinds of oppression and tries to bring that to the forefront in order to bring about a more equal world. And it was really important to these essayists to be on a feminist podcast and then in a feminist collection. That was something that they really wanted, because they thought, well, actually our work might not always be called feminist, but we think it's doing really important feminist work. And so we want to be in conversation with other feminist thinkers. But yeah, we have philosophers, technologists, we have people who work in big tech, we have people who resist big tech, community activists and organizers. Two of my favorite activists in the book are Sneha Revana, who is, at the time, I think when she wrote the essay, was only 16 or 17. She was the founder of a youth organization called Encode Justice, which grew rapidly and became one of the leading youth advocacy organizations in response to algorithmic injustice. And then Jennifer Lee, who at that time was working for the ACLU in Washington and leading a lot of really, really important policy and advocacy work around trying to restrict the power of big tech companies. And so we have people coming from very diverse life experiences, very different approaches. And in doing so, I hope that they show the really wide variety and diversity of what feminism can look like in the tech industry and outside of it as well, kind of challenging it from the outside.
Yeah, and I think that it's the framing of tech in very different ways. On this podcast, we talk about tech, we talk about companies, what are they building, what difference is it making, but really it's tech. Whereas I think the book and the podcast is very much more about the ethics behind it and the regulations and the philosophy, and which obviously aligns perfectly with what you do as the day job, if you like. So I wondered if we could just go through the sections and maybe pick out a couple of examples of the content just to give listeners a little bit of a flavour. So the first one is on good relations, and I picked up Blaise's, I think he might have even been the first one, and maybe that's why it resonated, because it just got me immediately thinking very differently to normal. And, that whole conversation for me was about how we have this drive for optimization, which drives a competitive nature when nature isn't competitive. Nature doesn't optimize, it does random things. So why do we force technology to do the same? And I thought that was a really, immediately, the first thing I read, I'm kind of like, oh, crikey, yeah, that's got me thinking.
Yeah, I love that this is the first essay in the book. And we chose that quite deliberately because Blaise works for big tech, works for Google, but is trying to challenge a lot of the assumptions that drive tech production. And one of them, as you've said, is this need to constantly optimize. But the other, and this is why the essay is called Good Technology is Cooperative, is challenging this idea that intelligence is something that resides in a single individual. So it's trying to move us towards a vision of intelligence as shared and collective, and says that this can help us rethink AI design in a way that is better reflective of the sociality of human beings and the fact that cooperating and living with one another has always been incredibly important. And I think one of the driving factors behind Blaise writing this essay is the fact that evolutionary metaphors are quite common in AI and tech development. And these, again, like you pointed out, can emphasize competition. And I think this is partly why we end up with some of these quite harmful ideas about AI, that we're going to end up in this contest with it. And I think what Blaise and a lot of the other authors in this section are doing is trying to lay out a different kind of pathway and say, there's ways that we can coexist with these technologies. And particularly if we look outside of the Western canon of science fiction and philosophy about technology, which tends to emphasize dominance and mastery or subjugation, and instead look at other kinds of religious and spiritual traditions, which emphasize a lot more balance, harmony, coexistence, and says we can find other ways to live with technology beyond this kind of Terminator myth.
And then I think the next one that struck a chord was the one from Margaret Mitchell, which was around good systems and infrastructure, regulation, talking about bias in systems and systematic discrimination. You've kind of touched on some of those elements, but, it might be worth recapping Margaret's essay there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think Margaret's essay comes first for any of our listeners. You are probably familiar with Margaret Mitchell or Meg Mitchell, who's now the chief ethics scientist at Hugging Face and was previously on Google's ethical AI team. And so this essay is coming from someone who has really lived out trying to do this debiasing work and trying to grapple with what it means to create an AI industry that is much more fair and equitable. And so in this essay, I think Meg lays out in a really clear and easily accessible way why we see so many kinds of structural injustice manifesting in AI systems and what kinds of changes and transformations need to happen in the AI industry for these to be different. And, Meg very clearly, I think, talks about the ways that the AI industry itself, which is, very unrepresentative. I think only 21 or 22% of AI professionals worldwide are women, and that, we don't even have data, for example, on how queer people are represented in AI or how people of color are represented in AI, and that this kind of level of homogeneity in the AI workforce can lead to a whole lot of different products being made and a whole lot of different systems being produced that don't serve a lot of marginalized populations, and also can actively produce or reproduce these kinds of stereotypes and harms. This was the quote which I think summarizes those two aspects, where Meg says, "It is critical to face the reality of systemic discrimination in tech and its dynamics to understand where we're currently situated as a society in creating good technology. In order to create good technology for tomorrow, we have to see a path there from where we are now. But where we are now leads down a path where people with characteristics that are not well represented in technology are also the victims of bad technology." And there's actually a beautiful illustration in the book, because the book has 2 illustrations per chapter, which shows this kind of dark path that Meg Mitchell is tracing. And so Meg, I think, because of probably her experiences in the tech industry, is a little bit less optimistic than some of our other thinkers in the book. But I think she makes some really crucial and important points about where we're at now.
Yeah, she does. And I there's a couple of things that stood out for me with what Meg said. So it was that call on equitable society. You've got to have less discrimination, but A, you've got to recognise it's there, and B, you've got to act on it. So that was kind of, I think maybe from her personal experience as well, that came across really, really strongly. And then the examples that she gave as well of where there's different things are disproportionately represented. So like religions, some of them associated with violence, age groups being completely absent. And I thought it was a really good challenge as a reader just to keep asking those questions. So the next one we had was Ranjit Singh's "Good technology is slow to scale." And do you know what? I really like this because, as usual, I was running around like a crazy person. And it literally gave me an invitation to slowness. And I really enjoyed that one. Would you like to just tell the listeners a little bit more about it?
Oh, this piece is really beautiful, and Ranjit's work is exceptional. It's also one of my favorite podcast episodes. So I would actually really encourage everyone to read this essay because I think the way that Ranjit writes is really beautiful and the illustrations are really beautiful. But I think what Ranjit does so well is push back against this kind of hyper-scaling and speed, which is very central to the AI industry and how it's marketed right now. So there's this idea that not only will AI speed up a lot of processes, whether or not we actually should speed those up, I think, is an ethical question we need to ask, but also this idea that tech companies can create products that will scale out perfectly across a number of global contexts and locations. And a lot of Ranjit's wider work is challenging that, I think, and says, well, not only are these technologies not responsive to local contexts, but also is speed something necessarily that we want to aspire to? And so Ranjit kind of links the practice of slowness in tech development and with data to generosity. And so I've actually got another quote here, this time from Ranjit's essay. And he says, "It is during this slow process of mutual shaping that meaningful interventions and erring on the side of generosity can be made. Rather than reacting to the harms of data-driven decision-making, it is time that we proactively account for its consequences and prepare for them. Whether this accounting happens through algorithmic impact assessments or through algorithmic audits, its effect is to slow the momentum of data-driven decision-making so that its consequences can be assessed or audited before its deployment in the real world." And yeah, so there's a thoughtfulness to Ranjit's work, which is not sort of uncritically valorizing slowness, but rather saying, this push to speed leads to meaningful harm, that the move fast and break things ethic is not one that we should be aspiring to, and that maybe doing things slower can allow for a gentler but also better tech development process.
Nice essay for the VCs to read then.
Absolutely, yes.
Are you a data-driven business looking for resilient infrastructure, connectivity, and the power to compute sustainably? KO Data develops and operates high-performance, energy-efficient data centers for advanced computing. Our scalable, state-of-the-art facilities support the mission-critical workloads of life sciences, biotech, and AI startups across the Cambridge Tech Cluster. To find out how we can help host your compute, get in touch at kodata.com/contact. KO Data, proud to sponsor the Cambridge Tech Podcast.
One that grabbed my attention was Good Visions. Yeah, I really like this one. Like in terms of good technology needs good stories. And the kind of, I guess, that mainstream media of scaremongering around, predicting the impact of new technologies. We're all hearing the scare stories of AI taking everyone's jobs. And then at the far end of that extremity is the whole Terminator, situation. So, yeah, talk to us about better narratives, more positive, because, we get to talk to, I think we did 20 or so AI interviews on this podcast alone last year. And the way AI is being used to actually impact society and lives in so many positive ways just gets lost in all of that negativity.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we really wanted to have this section in the book that focused specifically on science fiction narratives was because we saw how certain kinds of stories about AI were so powerful, both within organizations and more widely in how AI products were marketed. So we did this big study at a large tech company, and we found that, interestingly, a lot of the engineers and data scientists that we talked to tended to use the same cultural references to talk about AI. So Terminator was a big one, things like Iron Man. But what they had in common is they were effectively all humanoids with guns, and they were quite martial in their alignment. They were quite masculinist. And they often, again, were these stories about domination or subordination. And so one of the major strengths of the Leverhulme Centre's extensive research portfolio is thinking about AI narratives. So saying, what stories do we tell about AI? How can we trace the longer history of thinking about intelligent machines? And how can we look for different and alternative kinds of AI stories, again, outside of this Terminator mold, which is something that the Decolonizing AI Narratives project did for several years. And so the head of that project, Kanta Dihal, who wrote one of the essays in the book, I think makes a really good case for why the way that we communicate and talk about AI is so central and so important. And so every chapter in this section of Good Stories brings to life different kinds of examples of both stories about AI that might be narrowing our visions, whether that's 2001: A Space Odyssey, or in one of the chapters, this really awful VR experiment that Mark Zuckerberg did in Puerto Rico, through to kind of these more different and beautiful and engaging stories that often come from alternative cultural traditions, as I mentioned before.
Yeah, and the example there with Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, I read it and I'm covering my face again while I'm remembering it because it is just so awkward. But we won't talk any more about that. They'll just have to go and buy the book, right?
Yeah, it's pretty bad though. Definitely buy the book just to read this example because it was actually one I wasn't familiar with till I received Nedra and Felicity's essay, and I was like, wow, that's bad. And I see a lot of bad things. Again, when you're on the AI ethics side, you see more of the seedy underbelly of these tech projects, and that one still shocked me.
Yeah, so just kind of leaning on that, I've got a two-part question for you, which is the first is you talk quite a bit on the podcast about ideas and compromises. So, you can have a really good idea, but sometimes there's a negative that comes with it as well. And how do you consider that? So I'd just, give us a quick overview on that. And then the second one is whether good tech is personal. So I think, again, on one of the podcasts I listened to, you were talking about if you're diabetic, then actually a glucose monitor is the best thing for you. But then do you compromise because who's pushing that diabetes monitor to you? So do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yes, sure. I mean, I think what's really interesting about these two questions together is I think it speaks to the tensions that we experience in a lot of feminist activism, work, and scholarship around, on the one hand, a real set of radical political convictions, and on the other hand, the messy realities of living in the world that we live in. And I struggle in my own work to find the right line to walk a lot of the time. So to go to your second question, I think first, which was thinking about whether or not good technology is personal, Eleanor and I like to ask this question about good technology as a provocation, first and foremost. And that's why we think it's really important to clarify the question with, is it even possible to have good technology in the world that we live in? Or is technology always going to be a product of these environmentally damaging, capitalist and extractive practices that we see as being really, really harmful? And so what we often try to do is get people to think about technologies that are good to them individually, and then to zoom out and think about how these technologies part of wider webs of power. And so Eleanor likes the example of the glucose monitor. I use the example often of knitting needles, something which is very low tech, but I would argue is still a technology, is something that brings me a lot of joy. And I think there's something quite magical about using, two sticks and some yarn and turning it into fabric. But yeah, at the same time, for me, I would say rather than thinking about good technology necessarily as personal, because I don't think any one of us can be the sole arbitrator of like, this is or isn't good technology, I like to think of good technology as situated and local and community driven, which I think are some of the themes that come out of these different essays, whether it's Ranjit's fears around scaling or Jennifer Lees's work on community driven technology. I think one of the dangers of these mass scale technologies is that they promise perfect personalization. They promise that we will be treated as the unique individual. And at the same time, they see us as this massive data points from which they can extract data and sell products. And so I think there's something quite dehumanizing about that. And it also just means we end up with technologies that, as Sasha Constanza-Chock says, that are supposedly designed for this universal user. But the universal user tends to be a white man, tends to be someone who isn't disabled, and moves through the world in a particular way. And so I would say, yeah, for me, good technology isn't necessarily personal in that it's tied only to the individual, but I think that good technology should be maybe personable as a way of reframing it. It should be kind of human-centric, person-centric, community-centric, rather than productivity-focused, optimization-focused. So yeah, that's what I think about your second question. So your first question was around thinking through like compromises, right? I think this question is really interesting because on the one hand, I think this is a question around design processes and like how an idea is made and then how it gets carried through and like you say, where the compromises get made. And then the other aspect of this, I think, is dual use, or like what happens to a technology after it's deployed. And we have seen many examples of this where technology might have been made with one good intention, but then ends up being exploited and used in a variety of different ways. So take, for example, smart home technologies, which are intended to make people's lives easier, things like Amazon Alexa, which then get used for the purposes of coercive control or domestic abuse. And so these are getting exploited in harmful ways. And so I would say that I see these things as very connected. So even though people might have had really good intentions, when they were creating the product. Often when these products can be exploited so easily, it's because of maybe a certain narrowness in the design thinking at that ideation stage and the building stage. So these people might have thought of cybersecurity as being very much like, oh, we've got to make sure that no one can hack this device from the outside. But they might not have thought about the safety of users when it came to these technologies being exploited within the household, for example, which is again why I think like feminist perspectives and design and development are really, really crucial. I would also say this idea of compromise when it comes to the actual design process is really interesting, because to me, it's, what compromises get made and when, I think are very reflective of what a company or an organization thinks matters. And this is one of the big problems I think we see with accessibility and accessible tech is accessibility is often treated as like a last minute add-on or something at the very end of the process to say like, oh, is the technology accessible? And at that stage, it's usually too late. Like that's something that has to be integrated at the very beginning. So to me, the problem is not just when do compromises get made to serve company values or company profits, but also when a question gets asked in the process.
So are there good examples of companies that do this well or products that do this well in the tech space?
I think there's a mixture of products that I think do this in a really interesting way. I would say when it comes to companies themselves, I think that the companies that find it easiest to bring about sort of good AI ethics and AI governance policies are ones that already have a strong culture and institutional norm towards protecting customers, protecting the rights of individuals and communities. So, for example, I think organizations that have very strong data privacy rights and approaches tend to then maybe find it a little bit easier to understand some of the particular kinds of protections that might need to be brought about or strengthened in relation to AI and AI governance. I think though I also see a lot of hope in different kinds of smaller scale projects that have been developed by artists and academics and technologists to try and think about different ways of doing technology. So one of the authors that we have in the book, Priya Goswami, was the co-founder of an app called Mumkin, which was designed so that people could practice having conversations about female genital cutting before they went out into the real world to like have these difficult conversations with friends and family. And I see this as an example of a really intentionally designed technology for several reasons. And the first is that Priya herself came from over a decade of activism around female genital cutting. She's incredibly knowledgeable in this area. And one of the problems with a lot of these kinds of technologies is that they're developed by technologists who maybe actually don't know very much about the social issue that they're dealing with. And that was definitely not the case with Priya. And the second was that Priya and her wider team were really intentional with how they thought about the user experience. So not only did they really value things like the privacy of the user, but they also made sure that they designed it in such a way that it was as warm and as welcoming as possible. Because Priya says that a lot of the materials that are produced around female genital cutting tend to be quite violent, quite dramatic. They involve a lot of, say, black and red. And Priya was really intentional in saying, like, this is not the aesthetic we want. We don't want to shock. We don't want to re-traumatize. We want this to be the safest digital space that we can create. And so I can give more examples of these like kind of small scale projects, but I would also definitely recommend checking out the book, also checking out Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's Data Feminism. That has a lot of really wonderful projects that are exploring different ways of thinking about data, different ways of visualizing data or processing data that align with feminist principles.
Okay. No, we'd be sure to link to those in the show notes. So yeah, that'd be great. So, I mean, I think you've done a great job there of teeing up the book and getting people excited about it. Why don't we just spend a little bit of time going back to you personally? You're getting a lot of recognition for your work, which is fabulous. You're a Radio 3 New Generation Thinker, I think, for 2023. You're in the top 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics, 2022. You're in Computing Rising Stars, 30 in 2023 as well. I mean, so what is your career trajectory and what does success look like for you right now?
Oh, goodness. That's a really good and challenging question. I mean, I feel very, very lucky to have been doing this work at a moment when there's been a real societal appetite for expertise around technology and ethics. And so I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity that I've had. I think in terms of like where I would like to see my work go, two things. I mean, first, I would love feminist principles and ideas to be so normalized in the field of tech ethics and AI ethics that what Eleanor and I do is not seen in any way out of the ordinary. So one of the things that I like to say is that I hope in 50 years that to be completely irrelevant, because I absolutely do not want us to be struggling with the same problems that we're having now. But yeah, more seriously, I really love the idea that like success kind of, or this future career trajectory being about just the normalization of a lot of these ideas. Yeah, and then second, I'm really, really passionate about writing. So I think personally where I'd love to see my career go is doing a lot more public-facing writing. The experiences I've had on radio this year have really cultivated in me this passion for public storytelling. And so I'm hoping to do a lot more writing specifically on race and technology, but also weaving in a lot of my memoir and my own experiences into those discussions of technology, and thinking a lot about how new technologies can seem very abstract, but they shape so much of our daily life and our own perceptions of each other and ourselves. So that's something I'm really passionate about at the moment.
And I think it's brilliant. I think, the work that both yourself and Eleanor are doing and Kanta and everyone else is remarkable, and just keep having those conversations. You called yourself a serial hobbyist and you only do things for a year before you want to go and do something else. That's absolutely fine. Just keep doing what you're doing, because I think it's so important for people to see people like you going out having those conversations. But to bring it right back down, my last question is to both you and to Eleanor. Have you got a tattoo yet?
Oh my goodness. I do not have a tattoo as of yet. Do not tell my mom, because she will be very, very unhappy if I suddenly come back with a tattoo, but I'm very tempted. I don't know. Eleanor's away on holiday right now. Maybe she'll come back with a tattoo. We don't know. We've had some requests on where people can vote for which tattoo we should be getting. So we need to hold a poll soon. But no, I do actually want to use this as an opportunity to shout out our incredible illustrator, Singh Lee, who is responsible for one of the best parts of the book, which are these beautiful line drawing illustrations in every chapter and our very vibrant cover. So yeah, again, feeling very lucky to work with such a talented artist.
Yeah, they are absolutely brilliant. I've got my top 3, so I'll send them to you as well. They can go into the options, but I assume it'll be Eleanor having it rather than your good self.
Yeah, Eleanor can be like the test subject. You can get the first one. We'll see how it looks, and then maybe I'll commit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. We've really enjoyed talking to you. I believe that the first print run of the book sold out, so someone's frantically printing some more for the people who want to go and buy one. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, I hope they're frantically printing some more. Yes. So it was available on Waterstones, Amazon, Bloomsbury's website, and in some local bookstores. I think the Cambridge one has sold out. And yes, hopefully they'll restock it soon so you can grab hold of it. But if you ever see Eleanor and I wandering around Cambridge, we're always very happy to sign copies, chat about it. We really love hearing from people who've engaged at all in our work.
Yeah, and just for listeners, if you do go into a bookshop to find one, don't necessarily look on the bookshelf, because Eleanor keeps going in all the bookshops and putting them in random places that more people will see them. So there you go.
A nice marketing hack there. I like it.
Great. Point of sale. Good job. Thanks very much, Kerry.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It will really help others discover the show.
If you are a startup looking to grow in Cambridge, the Bradfield Centre offers a range of flexible membership packages which put you in control of your office and home working mix. There's a vibrant, collaborative atmosphere, on-site cafe, plenty of green outside space, and regular member social events. For more information, visit bradfieldcentre.com or call 01223 919 600.